This is Professor Woods. Today I'm going to talk about federal legislative history research. And we're going to go over three major points. What federal legislative history is and why we want to do this type of historical research. The second is, what is the evidence of legislative intent? And the third is, collecting the documents and note-taking. And throughout this lecture, I will refer to the online research guide at this URL that you see on your screen. But what is legislative history? Black's Law Dictionary defines legislative history as the background and events leading to the enactment of a statute, including hearings, committee reports, and floor debates. One of the primary purposes researchers investigate the legislative history of a particular piece of legislation or a particular statute is to determine the legislative intent. Although Justice Scalia would argue that legislative intent is not what we should care about. So, as you might guess, there are criticisms to using legislative history in deciding cases, and the most vocal critic happens to be Justice Scalia. And he gives these issues as the criticisms. Legislative history is not indicative of what Congress as a whole intended. Giving interpretive weight to legislative history treats it as law. Legislative history sources allow legislators to manipulate the courts. And Scalia is proud of being a textualist. And he wants to stay within the statutory text to determine its meaning. We do not inquire what the legislature meant. We ask only what the statute means. And he actually wrote a whole book on it. And the book is titled A Matter of Interpretation. We have this particular book in our library, and its call number is KF4552.S28, and you can check it out and read what Justice Scalia said if you're so inclined. But when is legislative history used? Here are the threshold conditions. When the language of the statute is ambiguous, to avoid an absurd result, that means the statute is out of harmony with reason, to prevent the law from turning on a drafting error, to understand the specialized terms in a law, to understand the reasonable purpose of a law, and to choose a reasonable purpose in a political landscape. But how is it used? So let's say side A argues that the plain meaning of the law is clear. Side B says, no, it's ambiguous, and we need to look at documents to find out what the legislature really meant. Or they could just say, we looked at these documents and they have a completely different meaning. Now let's click on over to the research guide, and we'll look at the flowcharts that I have on how a bill becomes law. The guide itself starts in this particular tab called Pre-Research, but I really want you to now look at the flowcharts that are available, and they are in PDFs on the left-hand side. The flowchart shows that a bill is introduced in either the House or the Senate, so it either gets an S in front of it or an HR for House of Representatives in front of the number. They're just consecutive. It's referred to a committee. The committee holds hearings. Most of the bills die in committee. And if it gets reported out, then it may have to go back to another committee. There could be more than one committee, so it might have to do this process, this committee process, where it could die at any moment along the way. But if it makes it out, it is debated on and voted in that chamber, and then it is sent to the other chamber. It retains its number, including the prefix, the S or the HR. But it's introduced again, it's referred to committees in the other chamber, and the committee will hold hearings. It could die here. There could be more committees, but if it makes it out, it will be voted on the floor. But what if the other chamber wants some slightly different language? Well, then they have to go to the conference committee. And the conference committee, composed of members of both chambers, and they decide how it's going to read, and it may not come out of that committee, but if it does, it goes back to both chambers' floor for debate and vote. If it survives all this, the bill is then sent to the president to either sign it or veto it. It's printed as a public law. That's when it gets the PL number. And then the public law are collected at the end of a session, and they go into the statutes at large. So the statutes at large are the U.S. federal session laws. And then they're codified into the United States Code. Let's go back to the research guide, and we'll go to the pre-research tab this time to see what the hierarchy of documents are. From the most valuable to the least, most valuable is the conference committee report, if there is one, followed by the committee reports, either chamber or both, followed by committee prints. Now these are documents that the committee relied on when they were making their decision, and then followed by debates. The bill itself, the bill could undergo various changes, and then there are hearings, and presidential signing statements are the least valuable because they're merely political statements. So we're going to grab the Federal Legislative History worksheet. Before we leave this screen, I'm going to show you how we're going to gather all these numbers and documents. So start with putting your name and the date on the top, and then I haven't given you the issue yet, but that's where you're going to put it, as well as the statute, and then we're going to put the history in these boxes, and we're going to gather as many of these numbers and things that we will need when we are actually getting these documents. It depends on where we get them. This concludes the first part of Federal Legislative History.